Hi everyone, Professor Lucien here again. This is lecture 20 if I'm not mistaken, and after you've completed the work on this particular lecture, we are 2/3 of the way through the course. So we're going to talk about welding, cutting, and brazing. I've kind of patched together a few different presentations and brought in some of my own. This information is from lecture 2. So we're going to be talking about fires, explosions, burns, and as you can see from a fatal perspective, fires and explosions, not just limited to welding and cutting, but it contributes to it, is lower, much lower rate or number of events than others, but still, when it does happen, it's a big concern. As far as welding citations, so this total is a lot lower than what we've had in previous lectures. So the average cost of a welding citation is just a little over $3,000. In manufacturing an AICS 3.2, it's about $4,100. In previous lectures, it was manufacturing 3.1 that had the highest average, but not so much when it comes to welding. So there are different, now this is where I patched some things together. So there are different hazards associated with it. Fire, obviously. And I've got a cute little video from YouTube that shows you fails, and fires tends to be the main one. Metal splatter, electric shock, that's for arc welding. Explosions, depending on what kind of gases you're working with. Release gases, which has multiple issues. Radiant energy is a big one, especially with arc. And then welding fumes, or metal oxides. So I'm going to try to cover all of these. So there are 3 basic types, and I've also provided a supplemental welding PowerPoint for you that you can take a look at. Now, I personally have never learned to do welding. I basically have an idea what it is. Excuse me. I've sweated pipes before, which is just basically soldering, very simple form, welding. But you've probably already read what this is all about. It's just basically the merging of 2 metals. And then there's different types of cutting. What is in here is plasma cutting, which you need to do. Usually you have a robotic machine that's actually doing the cutting on a bed of water. I'm just going to focus on general industry or subpart Q. You can see over my shoulder. I've got it up on my dry erase board. Some of the general requirements. So fire is the primary concern when you're doing welding. Because there are sparks, coming off, and then you're generating a lot of heat, and there's metal, molten metal that's dropping beneath. So what you want to do, protect yourself or protect the welder, and then make sure the environment doesn't have things that could ignite and catch fire. So ignitable materials, you don't want flammable liquids or any explosive gases in the environment at all. So here it looks like you got somebody welding near compressed gases. So if there's like some form of a unknown leak, it could catch it. And there are incidents in which people do welding on containers, barrels, tanks, which used to contain a flammable liquid or a gas, and they didn't properly vent and clear it. I mean, one thing you could do is, you could wash it out. Another thing you could do is fill it with inert gas like nitrogen. If there's no oxygen in there and the flame gets in there, it's not going to ignite. But once you break through it, there'll be a mixing, and then you could have a problem. So you need to remove combustible materials. If you're going to you need to have a fire watch to make sure people are watching to make sure things aren't catching. You should have a fire extinguisher nearby, and you see the fire watch lasting 30 minutes after you've completed it, the cutting or welding. So somebody has to be there watching to make sure there are no embers that happen to remain. An authorization is the person responsible must inspect the area. Floors must be cleared, swept away, 35 feet away. Combustible materials. There are prohibit areas as well. You can see that on here where sprinklers are impaired, unauthorized management, explosive atmospheres, things like that. We'll talk about the need for a hot work permit when people do welding in confined spaces. Welding underwater is also very, very dangerous because you have to bring your oxygen with you to do the welds. And if anything goes wrong, your environment could immediately kill you. Relocation of combustibles, again, it says 35 feet away. You could also use some forms of shield. Other special precautions when it comes to ductwork or conveyor systems. Combustible walls need to be shielded or guarded. And sometimes you'll see that they'll have welding blankets that they can put over things that provide sort of a barrier so that things can't catch. You got to watch out for pipes. You don't want to accidentally damage a different line, which could cause more problems. And management's responsible for doing assessments prior, coming up with proper procedures, making sure that there are responsible people on the job, make sure everybody has the training they need. And also if you have contractors, make sure they understand what your expectations are. Yeah, this is just more stuff. Supervisor responsibilities. I just talked about the used containers, proper venting and purging. Because it happens all the time that people start doing cutting. They think they purged it or vented it properly, or they don't really think that there is an explosive atmosphere on the inside of it, and then boom. Precautions taking over long periods. You can see here there's things you can do. Also, if you're working at a height in which there could be a problem, where you might have to panic or move, and you'll see this in the videos, you have to make sure that people are protected from falls. Let's see. Welding cable equipment must be kept clear from passages or ladders or stairways, so you don't want to violate the walking working surfaces. And you definitely need proper body, hand, feet, and eye protection. So, it's not just glasses; it's the welding hood to protect from the UV. Here you see some people doing welding. Get somebody helping out. They're just covering their eyes, which means their face is exposed. We'll talk about confined spaces later, but the thing is you should never bring your gas tanks into a confined space. It needs to be constantly ventilated, constantly. Because in your confined environment and you're producing fumes, it's going to displace oxygen, it's going to increase its concentration to dangerous levels. And sometimes the stuff that comes off is combustible itself. So you need to have continuous ventilation and be monitoring it. Lifelines. You have to be careful with the electrodes for arc welding. Gases need to have an automatic shut off, and there needs to be signs for hot metal. All these things we'll talk about when we get to confined spaces. General requirements for protecting: dimensions of the space, number of welders, possible evolution of hazardous fumes gases from the metals. There are a lot of things. I mean, when you're melding two metals together with high heat, there are all kinds of different metal oxides that are given off. And what I mean by a metal oxide or a fume is something that's burnt. It tends to be sticky, so it adheres to things. So if you ever go into a welding shop, you'll see that the ceiling, the walls, the ventilation is all coated with this fine black, tends to be black, can be metallic black, dusting, I guess you could call it that. I had shown you pictures of that when I showed reports from my consulting work. Remember, there was a diffuser that had fume on it because they had been doing welding on the main pipe for the fire suppression system, and it got into the ventilation and it attached itself. It's sticky. This stuff is also hazardous to breathe in. But if you just do it, if you're just allowing it to enter the air, it's going to adhere to things. It's going to make a mess. And then if people get it on their hands, they could get it into their body if they don't wash their hands before they eat, drink, or smoke. Sure, you can do, if you have general room ventilation, you're giving off fumes. It should be collected. So what you typically see is either a downdraft table, or they have articulating ventilation ports, which you can put close to or near where you're doing the welding, and then it sucks it right in, and it either filters it or sends it outside. Spaces for more than 10,000 feet per welder, that's a good way to do it. And you can tell if you don't have that because of the ceilings and walls and everything has this stuff on it. Room ceilings need to be lower than, or rooms with ceilings lower than 16 feet. It shouldn't be done. Confined spaces is another thing. Here they're showing cross flow ventilation if you're doing more of a permanent ventilation, but sometimes welders have to move about, and that's where you need the articulating arm, or what they affectionately call in the field a smoke eater, which is just a cart, which is a HVAC system, or not HVAC, just a air collection system, and then you move the nozzle to where you need it. So you don't want to keep it generally. You don't want to affect the person. Confined space needs continuous ventilation. You should be monitoring it. Outdoors, you just need to stay below the PEL. There are certain special rules for if you're doing pipelines, but I don't want to get into that. Oxy-fuel welding and cutting, there are general requirements here. It talks about maximum pressure, approved apparatus. You know, you got to be careful when you're working with acetylene oxygen, because acetylene burns, oxygen, it burns but it accelerates it. When you combine the two, it explodes. I've tested that with friends before. Don't do that. People called the cops on us. Cylinders are another issue. We're going to talk about cylinders, or we talked about cylinders, sorry, in lecture 19. I'll be combining that lecture with this lecture and actually changing things around, something I noticed as I was putting all these things together. Because compressed gas cylinders are another safety concern in themselves, and they're typically used for welding operations. So we talked about this in 19, about the separation of oxygen and acetylene, primary. Don't really rely on the 5 foot high non-combustible partition. I've seen it in places. I'd rather keep the things apart, and I think a lot of safety professionals would agree with me. Arc welding has another issue. I mean, you have to be careful for shock or possible fraying of insulation of those lines. Electrode holders, you know, it talks about splices 10 feet away from the holder, things like that. Cylinders need to be secured. You need to check all the equipment. You need to control for leaks, things like that. And when the tanks are being stored, they need to be secured, properly labeled if they're empty, things like that. And it talks about when you remove or open a valve, be slow about it, be quick about it, because if there's an immediate release, you can't control it. It's just a matter of time before it reaches an ignition source. Excuse me. It talks about connecting the welding lines. How long must a fire watch continue? I think you remember it's 30 minutes. How far away are the combustibles? I think you remember 35 feet. Radius. Who is responsible for making fire watches available? Supervisors. During work in confined spaces, what must be left outside? The tanks. Here are some other things we can look at. What you see, the one on the left, I think that looks probably okay, but on the right, you got a lot of stuff sitting there and they're not all secured. Here you can obviously see damaged lines. This look like electrodes for arc welding, and look what it's stored right next to. Gas tanks. See, that's not right. Here we've got a gas can stored right next to, looks to be some gas that needs to be kept somewhere else. Here, it looks like they're holding it together with a rope. It might even be a bungee cord for all I know. It needs to be something stronger, like the chain that's down below. Otherwise, it'll fall over. So now we're going to shift gears just a little bit to the welding fumes. I believe I took this from a Canadian website, and I think it's pretty good. So it's a pure copy and paste from their website, but I think I still provided you with the link. So welding fumes are not only the oxidized metal that is being molted and put together, which is hazardous to humans, but also all kinds of gases that are given off too. And you should do air monitoring for employee exposure to that stuff. But this is another why you should be have more, big open spaces, ventilation, or actual collection at the source. These are all things you need to be doing. Let's get different examples of welding gases that are used. I think we pretty much talked about these. One thing to keep in mind is if the metal they're working on has a coating on it, whether it's a paint coating, plastic coating, or petroleum-based coating, all these things can cause problems, and it kind of shows you here some of those chemicals. So how do coatings change the composition of welding fumes? Well, I know galvanized steel tends to be the dirtiest, and so you're going to find more of the range of the metal oxides there. Plating can be an issue as well. And here's a breakdown of the types of metal fumes and the health effect. I'm not going to go over all of these. The most concerning is something like chromium. There could be the chromium-6, which is it's cancer-causing. It's a carcinogen. Others, manganese is a concern. That's metal fume fever. Zinc oxides, metal fume fever. I've seen nickel being a concern. Lead oxide affects the nervous system, kidneys. Any others? Aluminum, beryllium. These can be, again, that falls in the metal fume fever. Carbon monoxide, is the incomplete combustion of carbon. That's obviously hazardous. Hydrogen fluoride can be an issue too. It's irritating because it's an acid base. You get the other oxide. Ozone also causes mucous membrane irritation, but it can also burn the lungs. Because it's triatomic oxygen, so it burns whatever it touches. Then they've got some cyanides. Phosgene can be transformed from other things, usually from, I think, volatile organics can convert to phosgene if exposed to high heat, such as welding. So what can you do to prevent it? There's a lot of things you can do. One, clean off the surfaces to prevent the coatings. Use proper ventilation, especially local ventilation. Wear appropriate PPE. So I have two examples here. The one on your left is more of a permanent system. So this is like a welding booth. The one on the right is more of a mobile system. And you can see you can adjust it to make sure it's drawing the fumes away from the user. It's collecting it and then rebringing it into the work environment. So that's pretty much everything with the PowerPoint. There is a handout you can look at here. I've got a link to OSHA's welding, cutting, and brazing page here. It shows you not only the standards, but other information. I've got two videos. One is the fails. You'll like this one. Shows people catching fire, some other problems. This is welding basics, so it'll really go into the mechanics of it. This is a link to Welding Fume control page. It's OSHA's. And this is that Canadian site that I just borrowed from. Here's a bonus deck if you're really interested and want more. Additionally, you can look at local suppliers. And I know Miller up in the Fox Valley, we used to have students intern there, and they've got some great information about air filtration and everything you need to make sure you have a safe welding system. They produce it. They also have safety data sheets, so if you want to know what's there. So that's really all I wanted to cover with welding. Just basically, there's the fire issue. There is also, what I didn't bring something up that I was supposed to, and I just reminded myself, and that is the arc. There's something called Flash Eye. Maybe what I'll do is I'll add a video. So you can watch that. There's some short ones. I'll watch one by an ophthalmologist. That if you look at the arc for arc welding, it can actually cause a sunburn in your eyes, and it's very, very painful. There's some treatments, but basically you just have to get over the burn, and skin can be burned as well. It is very painful. I've heard that it's like having all kinds of sand crammed in your eye and you can't get it out, and it also comes to you far after you get done welding. And I had a former student whose husband was a welder and got off the shift. Yeah, he tried to look away, or he just did it, and he thought he was okay, and then like 12 hours later is when the pain came on. So always make sure you're wearing the welding helmet that's designed for the type of work you're doing. And if you're doing arc welding, you should put up some sort of barrier, and it can be like a color barrier so you can still see if somebody's in there. But what it does is it's meant to capture the ultraviolet light that comes off of arc welding. So make sure, I wish I had brought that up. I will provide a video for you. Please watch that.